I'm going to talk about early agreements in the European Parliament and look at what the effect is of those early agreements on parliamentary debates in national parliaments. And I will do that through answering the following question. When do proposals for EU legislation, EU directives, fly under the radar of national parliaments in EU member states? And the focus of my presentation is on the ordinary legislative procedure. I will only focus on directives in negotiation at the EU level, and I will look at various costs and benefits of MPs to pay attention to these EU directives or ignore those directives. And my theoretical argument is that when there are high costs, parliamentarians at the national level probably ignore the EU legislation discussed between the European Parliament, the Commission and the Council. And when there are high benefits for parliamentarians, they will notice what is happening at the EU level and will start referring in their debates to these proposals for EU directives. Now what I did was I started thinking about, okay, what are the incentives for MPs to pay attention to EU legislation in discussion, in negotiation at the EU level? Not only the incentives, but also the disincentives. And I framed it in terms of cost and benefits. And what I wanted to explain is first the dependent variable, so the variation in the number of references to EU directives in national parliaments. By MPs, so not by the government or civil servants, but just exclusively by MPs. I wanted to see if there's variation between EU directives. And I wanted to explain the variation in those references in parliamentary debates, plenary debates, committee meetings, by looking at identifying these incentives and disincentives, costs and benefits. Now first some remarks on the costs. My idea was, I hypothesized that when there is new legislation or amended legislation at the EU level, that it's interesting for MPs to pay attention to these EU directives. And they then start referring to those directives in committee meeting debates and in plenary debates. Well, there are also several other benefits for MPs, triggers for MPs to pay attention to EU directives in a negotiation, such as very long negotiations at the EU level. That's another trigger for MPs to pay attention to EU directives. But there are also various costs. I will come back to some of these benefits that I will not discuss right now when I'm going to discuss the results. There are also certain costs involved. So when an MP decides to either pay attention in a plenary debate or in a committee meeting to what is happening at the EU level, he needs to understand what is happening at the EU level. So if a dossier is highly complex, it is highly likely that an MP needs to invest a lot of resources to understand this dossier. And if the costs are very high and the resources are, of course, limited for MPs, probably the dossier is going to be ignored. Now another cost, and I started my presentation, and it's also in the title of my presentation, another cost involved is informal trialogues or early agreements. What we see is that the European Parliament and the Council increasingly strike deals with each other behind closed doors, with a small group of representatives of those institutions on EU directives, also highly salient ones. And it's very difficult for MPs to actually follow what is happening at the EU level. So my idea was that if there are these informal trialogues, these early agreements between institutions at the EU level, that then there's a high risk that national parliamentarians need to invest a lot of resources to find out what is exactly happening. So here again, high costs, so probably low references in a low number of references in plenary debates and committee meetings by national parliamentarians. So I have here now a model how to test it. Now what I did was I collected data on almost 300 directives, all agreed upon, successfully negotiated upon by the EU institutions in the co-decision procedure or the ordinary legislative procedure in the period 2000 and 2010. So I have 10 years and I ran various regression models to find out whether the variation in the references in plenary debates and committee meetings in the House of Commons and in the Dutch House of Representatives, if this variation in the dependent variable can be related to those costs and the benefits that I showed earlier in my model. So I needed also to identify the cost and benefits to look at the characteristics of the negotiations, the number of days that negotiations went on, but also the characteristics of the directives themselves. Were they agreed in first reading, in second reading, in third reading, with informal trilogues or not. All these things I also coded and also looked at the national level, whether an issue is salient or not at the national level by looking at media data. So here you can see on the slide an overview of the various databases that I used. Now I'm going to shortly show you the results table of the regression models, and I will also highlight some of the main elements and will go into detail afterwards. So here you can see the entire table. At the top you can see the dependent variable, which is the variation in references in national parliaments during the negotiations on an EU directive at the EU level. So that can be a very limited time, and sometimes it can take years. And I would like to discuss three findings. Those are the most important findings. In green you can see the side of the benefits, in red the costs. And it's clear that only one real cost can be identified for MPs. We can see a negative effect, but we can also see a lot of positive effects. Now, to summarize this table, I came up with one slide, and in this slide I will summarize the most important and most significant findings of my analysis. And that's first 2 points on the benefits. MPs are triggered to pay attention to EU directives in negotiation at the EU level in parliamentary debates when EU level negotiations go on for a very long time. So the longer negotiations go on at the EU level, even controlled for various other variables, the more attention is paid by MPs. Fairly straightforward effect. What we also can see is that when newspaper articles are published on what is happening at the EU level, we can clearly see that that triggers the attention by MPs as well. And there's a clear direction in this effect. First media attention, and then parliamentarians start paying attention. At least there's a strong correlation. I of course do not know what is going on in the heads of the MPs and whether they really read the article, but at least we can see a strong correlation and also a sequence in the occurrence of variation. But there is also, and this is my main point, a high cost involved for MPs when paying attention to EU directives. When an EU directive is agreed upon in an early agreement, so behind closed doors at the EU level between the European Parliament, some representatives of the European Parliament, and the Council and the Commission, then it's very hard to follow for national parliamentarians what is happening. We can see both for the UK and the Netherlands in plenary debates and committee meetings that they pay much less attention to these EU directives agreed upon in first reading, early second reading, behind closed doors, even if the dossiers that are discussed are highly salient. I controlled for that. Now, what does this all mean for the democratic legitimacy of the multi-level parliamentary system? Now, if we look at some recent data on agreements in the European Parliament and the Council, we can see that there's a very strong increase in first readings and early second readings, and especially dossiers are concluded behind closed doors through these informal trialogues and the early agreements. So we get more and more first readings, and we know that MPs have a lot of difficulty of following what is happening in those informal trialogues. And if we now consider and see in the graph that almost 90% of all dossiers are concluded in first reading, and many of those first reading are behind closed doors, this is clearly a barrier for MPs and also a hindrance for the further development of a true multi-level democratic system. Thank you.